The satin bow on a black key fob caught the afternoon sun and flashed like a smirk. I held it in my palm and felt the leather grain, cool and foreign, as if it had always belonged to someone else. The dealer had wrapped the keys in crisp paper. The ribbon wound so neat it looked rehearsed. I placed them on the kitchen table next to my chipped coffee mug and the plastic piggy bank that had been my saving ritual for 38 years. The piggy bank was warm from a morning in the sun. Inside were 3 wrinkled bills that folded like tiny apologies. $3. After decades of saving coupons, funerals, repairs, and birthdays, $3. I laughed once, a thin cough that tasted of lemon soap and disbelief. I asked myself out loud why the ribbon gleamed harder than the gratitude in his eyes. I asked out loud who was the gift really for. I was 63 when this began in earnest. I was the mother, the one who had stitched together birthday cakes with trembling hands and driven teenagers to jobs in the rain. I was the one who had signed forms and co-signed loans, who had sat in waiting rooms with a book and a bag of hard candies. I had believed that family was a contract written in deeds of love, not in paper and ink. He, my son Mark, was 41, charming in the way that makes people forgive slights. He was my thin boy who had learned to name the parts of a car before he could tie his shoes. He had married Jenna 3 years earlier, and Jenna impressed people the same way a new handbag does. They were polite at church, smiling with their teeth. They were generous in public, lavish in appearances. And privately, their hands had always been too ready to take. If you are watching now, subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. Say it in the comments in one sentence. I want to know which kitchen this story is reaching, because I have come to believe that this story is not only mine. I had a life of small rituals. I stored my money in a shoebox under a sweater in the hall closet and in the piggy bank on the shelf. I balanced checkbooks carefully on the kitchen table, the paper soft at the corners from fingers that had jotted down grocery lists and doctor appointments. I baked lemon pound cake and left notes on the fridge. I had photographs tacked to a corkboard that smelled faintly of cork and lemon oil. My husband had died 10 years before. His work gloves still smelled of sawdust and linseed oil tucked under a loose floorboard. I kept his watch in a drawer because I could not bear to see the empty space on his wrist. Those were the textures of my days. My backstory is not a simple paragraph. It is a layered thing. I grew up with hands that learned to mend before they learned to measure money. My father taught me how to balance an account when I was 10 and how to fix a leak when I was 12. I married at 23 to a man who could build a porch and who could make me laugh even when my mother called to nag. We saved slowly and carefully. We borrowed once to put a new roof on the house. We ate beans and rice sometimes so our children could have piano lessons. I worked in payroll at a small company for 24 years. I kept receipts like little talismans. After my husband died, I learned to pay bills electronically, but I still preferred paper. I liked the feel of a page. It felt like proof. When Mark left for college, he called me every Sunday. He wrote long notes when he could not visit. He used to hide coins in my pockets as a joke. Those memories were my armor. The first time something sounded wrong, it was small and domestic. It was the smell of cologne that was not Mark cologne and not Jenna cologne, but a cheaper synthetic scent that lingered in the hall. The second wrong thing was a text message to my phone from a number I did not recognize that thanked me for dinner. The third wrong thing was the ribboned key fob. Mark placed the keys beside the piggy bank with a flourish and a wink and said, "Please, do not sell your car, Mom, since we got you something better." He laughed like the line was clever. I opened my mouth to say thank you and closed it because I had not been thanked when I had paid for his first car, or his college book fees, or wired money when his account had been overdrawn. I had stood in line at the bank with a wad of bills and mailed him a check that said, "For rent," in a shaky script. I had been the creditor who never expected interest. I found the first real clue by accident. I was looking for a glue stick and pulled open the top drawer where I kept envelopes and stamps. Beneath a stack of expired warranties, I felt a second, thinner envelope. It was not mine. The paper was heavier and smelled faintly of printer toner and coffee. Inside was a receipt from a downtown dealership showing a transfer of $60,000 and a line that said, "Sale to Jenna Miller." There was a manager initial and a stamp. My hands trembled, and the light in the kitchen seemed to sharpen. I could hear the neighbor Paul mowing his lawn in the background, and the pulse in my wrists like a second clock. The receipt was wet at one corner where my thumb had left a smudge. My mouth went dry. The piggy bank sat beside the receipt like a stage prop. I asked questions in a voice that tried to be calm. I asked Mark about the keys. He smiled and deflected. He told me the story of a generous in-law who wanted to give his mother a car that matched her hair and her style. Jenna called the BMW a thank you for being supportive. Everyone had a story that smelled like perfume and the inside of a gift bag. But the numbers did not add up, and I had always been suspicious of numbers. I started to collect. I wrote down dates. I waited for small cracks to become fissures. The discovery scene smelled like dust and lemon oil and the metallic cold of receipts. I could feel the paper, the scratch of ink, the subtle indentation where someone had pressed a pen too hard. I could hear Jenna in the living room dropping a laugh like glass and Mark humming in the garage. I tasted the coffee going stale in my mouth. I touched the edge of the receipt again, as if proof had a texture that would reassure me. I peeled open an old bank statement and found transfers I had not authorized. There were payees with names that sounded like companies, but registered as personal. The amounts were small at first, $2,000 here, $5,000 there, like a slow leak in a boat that you only notice when the floor begins to slick. Then there were larger entries that commented like footnotes to a story I had not agreed to. I named people. Mark, my son, who delivered the keys. Jenna, my daughter-in-law, who accepted the gift and smiled when the camera came out. Paul, my neighbor, who complained about noise but brought over pies at holidays. Rosa, my friend from the church who had offered to help me with online banking. Detective Alvarez from the local precinct who listened but did not promise miracles. Attorney Coleman who specialized in elder fraud. Lily, my granddaughter who loved to draw in the margins of my crossword puzzles. Tom, a reporter from the local paper who knocked on my door once and asked to tell my story. Each of them would move like pieces on a board. Each had a voice and a motive and a small ripple to the events that had begun to corrode my life. The first formal investigation began when I took a photo of the receipt and sent it to Rosa and to Attorney Coleman. The photograph made the receipt more real and helped me to see in pixels what my shaking hands could not hold. The image had a glare across the signature like a cataract. Rosa suggested I scan every piece of paper I could find and to make copies. Attorney Coleman advised me to request bank records directly from the bank and to freeze accounts that looked compromised. He explained in a measured voice what a power of attorney meant and how it could be abused. He told me that a power of attorney could be a legal blank check in the wrong hands and that signatures could be forged by people who had practiced them until they matched an old hand. For the first time, words like fraud and restitution were not only in my head, but became procedures to pursue. I felt both foolish for not having known earlier and stubbornly saved by my late habit of keeping paper. Every scene of searching had textures. The attic smelled of cedar and old rain. The spare room smelled of detergent and lavender. The garage smelled of motor oil and hot metal. The dealership smelled of new plastic and lemon cleaner. The bank smelled like recycled paper and the cold of a vault. The clerk at the bank, a young woman named Daniela, placed her palms on the counter and said, "We will run this report and it may take a few days." Her voice was efficient and touched by a little sympathy. She asked for my signature and for my ID. She tapped at keys that clicked like a metronome. She printed a ledger and handed it to me with a small bow of the head. Those small gestures mattered. They were evidence of process. I learned some technical things, and I learned them the hard way. Forensic accounting is not a mythical craft. It is a methodical tracing of transactions across ledgers and timestamps and IP addresses. Banks keep metadata that shows where a login occurred from and on what device. Receipts have unique identifiers, and a manager initial does not substitute for a signed contract. A transfer labeled as a loan is not the same as bank approval of a sale. I read about how signatures can be traced by pressure points and how a forger can mimic a flourish but not the rhythm of a life made of repeated strokes. I asked Attorney Coleman to explain in plain language, and he said that a forensic report would examine digital footprints and timestamps and compare signatures. He said that restitution can be sought even if funds have been moved through multiple accounts, but that it is expensive and slow. He suggested filing for an emergency temporary restraining order to prevent further transfers. He recommended a private investigator for photographs and time-stamped observations and a forensic accountant for a paper trail. I began to collect witness statements. Paul swore he had seen Jenna drive an unfamiliar car to the grocery store and that she had bragged about a weekend getaway. Rosa admitted she had helped Jenna set up an online bill pay because Jenna claimed she was a neighbor and needed help with a shared utility. Tom, the reporter, asked questions with a pen tapping the paper and promised to keep identities vague if I wanted. Lily drew a car and a piggy bank and wrote "Mother" in blocky letters next to them, and I kept that drawing for nights when the house seemed too large. Detective Alvarez came over with a notebook and a slow, patient face. He asked for a list of transactions and promised to send someone to the dealership to ask about the sale details. There were moments of tension that took the breath out of me. One night, I opened the bank ledger and saw a transfer that specifically referenced my name and a supposed power of attorney dated a month after my husband died. The paper had the smell of copier toner and a faint streak of oil. I felt like I had been asleep and was suddenly awake in someone else's life. I slowed and read it again and felt my heart move as if someone had grabbed it. I sat down on the kitchen chair, and the wood felt hard and colder than I remembered. The sinking sensation was precise and sharp like a needle in the back of a throat. For a long moment, the radio played a song from the 70s, and it sounded like background noise to a film where the protagonist finally sees the map. I called Attorney Coleman, and he told me to breathe and to document everything. He asked me if I had seen the original power of attorney, and I told him no. He explained that a power of attorney can be notarized and processed electronically, but still be forged if someone had copied a signature. He asked me not to confront anyone yet. I tried to confront gently, and immediately the family tightened. I spoke to Jenna in the living room where the afternoon light slanted across the rug. The carpet smelled of cleaning spray and my throat rasped. I asked simple questions and she answered with a practiced openness. She said of course I would never do such a thing and laughed a small laugh that she used when she wanted to deflect. Mark stood by the sink, rolling a dish towel with anxious hands. The conversation became a scene where polite sentences collided and left bruises. The more formal I was, the less they took me seriously. Mark said the car was a gift from Jenna's mother and that my name had been included in paperwork only by mistake. Jenna said the signature on the power of attorney was likely photocopied from an old document. Paul suggested I was confused. Rosa looked away and said maybe I ought to rest. Each reaction was a small tidal force that pushed me away from certainty. I escalated by recording conversations and by writing down what was said in real time. I began to speak to Detective Alvarez more frequently and to press the bank for document copies. He suggested subpoenaing the dealership paperwork and calling the manager directly. I learned to ask for timestamps and details like vehicle identification numbers and original registration. I found out that a luxury car like that leaves transactional fingerprints from the dealership that are hard to erase. The manager at the dealership, a man named Harris, sent an email that had server headers that showed IP addresses from a computer used by Jenna's email. That was a small victory, and it smelt like coffee and printer ink. The big confrontation with Mark was scheduled in my living room on a Friday when the house felt like the inside of a watch with gears suddenly exposed. I invited Detective Alvarez and Attorney Coleman to be present because I wanted witnesses and I wanted there to be a record. I had prepared questions and I had a recorder in my hand because I had learned that live memory can be slippery. The scene required many exchanges like a chess match. We spoke with short sentences and then longer ones to hold details. I said, "Why did you sign the paperwork?" He said, "I did not sign anything." I said, "The signature is yours." He said, "Not mine." I said, "Then who did it?" He said, "Maybe Jenna did it." I said, "Did you ask Jenna to buy it?" He said, "No, it was a surprise." I said, "Who paid for it?" He said, "Jenna's mother helped." I said, "Your bank shows transfers." He said, "Those were loans I repaid." I said, "The dates match when my checkbook was altered." He said, "You are mistaken." I said, "The dealership has emails from her account." He said, "I do not know how that happened." I said, "Have you been moving my money?" He said, "Only the money I thought you would give." I said, "You took from my account without consent." He said, "You always had plenty." I said, $3 in the piggy bank says otherwise." He said, "You are being dramatic." I said, "Do not call my life a drama." Mark's face shifted between anger and panic. Jenna folded her hands tight and began to whisper, "I am sorry," like a rehearsed line. Detective Alvarez interjected with questions about dates and witnesses, and the recorder picked up every small intake of breath. Attorney Coleman asked if Mark had ever had power of attorney, and Mark said no. The back and forth was exhausting, and it lasted long enough for me to feel the taste of metal in my mouth. The exchange was rich in sensory details because truth is messy. I could see the sweat forming at the hairline of Mark's forehead. I could smell the lavender of Jenna's perfume mixing oddly with the tang of motor oil he had on his jacket. I could hear Lily playing a video game in her room and the occasional beep like the metronome of an ordinary life. I could feel the coarse fabric of the couch under my knees as I leaned forward to be heard. I could touch the recorder, its plastic, cold, and grimly reliable. The room had the static electricity of a storm before rain. My voice felt thin but steady in that charged air. The pattern of evasion continued until I produced the bank ledgers stamped by the teller Daniela and the email headers that linked Jenna's account to the dealership server. The room shifted when those documents appeared. Mark flinched and dropped his eyes the way a man who had practiced honesty as a costume does when the costume rips. He muttered some unclear sentence about misunderstanding, about loans, about a promise he had made. Attorney Coleman leaned forward and said, "We can pursue a motion for temporary custody of assets and we can subpoena the accounts." He explained in a plain way what restitution could look like and how we would prove conversion of assets. Detective Alvarez said we could present evidence to the district attorney and that they would evaluate charges of fraud and conspiracy. That language landed like tools in a box. It promised action, but not always immediate repair. We planned. The planning phase was quiet and precise. We created a list of documents to assemble. We photographed every paper with my phone and uploaded copies to a secure cloud drive that smelled of new plastic and server ozone. We created shadow accounts so that any further transfers would be visible and traceable. Attorney Coleman drafted a complaint that outlined the suspected misappropriation of funds and the likely forgery of a power of attorney. He recommended a specialist in signature analysis and a forensic accountant named Mina who could follow the paper trails across banks. Mina had a way of speaking that made ledgers sound like maps. She asked for CSV files, export logs, and login records, and she explained how an electronic transfer leaves metadata even when moved across accounts. The plan included a recorded meeting with Jenna where she would be asked to explain certain transfers, and an offer to mediate only if full disclosure was given. We prepared a press statement for Tom in case the family wanted to control the narrative. We set a date to request subpoenas and to ask the judge for a temporary restraining order on the vehicle and any accounts in which my name appeared as beneficiary. During the planning period, I used surveillance in small ways. I set my old phone to record when I could not be present, and I asked Lily to keep notes of conversations. I bought a cheap digital camera and used it to capture receipts and license plates when I had to. I felt awkward, like a person of my generation using espionage, but desperate people will become stealthy. I documented deliveries to Jenna's house and mapped travel patterns. I collected screenshots of messages and printed them because paper felt more credible to me. Those printed messages smelled faintly of toner, and the corner of each page had the slight curl of a life that had been handled. I also learned the moral strange terrain of confronting my own child. I asked myself why this had to go public. I asked why I had to become a detective to protect what was mine. I thought about the definition of patrimony and how family patrimony can be consumed by a subtle con. I wondered how many times kindness had been mistaken for permission. The planning stage required not only documents, but a recalibration of what justice looked like. I wanted restitution, but I also wanted Mark to understand the harm. The difference between a legal remedy and a moral repair was not always bridged by court orders. We set a trap in the form of a mediated conversation arranged in a neutral room at the local community center. I made sure that Detective Alvarez and Attorney Coleman were present and that Mina had prepared a brief timeline of transfers to show. I invited Rosa and Paul as neutral witnesses. Jenna agreed to come because she said she wanted to clear the air. The mediator was a woman named Claire who had the soft, authoritative voice of someone who had seen many family storms and helped to calm them. The room smelled of institutional coffee and of paper. We sat in chairs arranged in a circle. The mediation was the moment I had been building toward. I opened a folder and slid the timelines across the table. The paper made a sound like a small gate. Jenna's face changed like a cloud passing over. She asked how I had obtained the documents, as if the method might invalidate the truth. I said I would worry about that later and asked her to explain how transfers in the ledger were labeled as loans when there was no promissory note. She said she did not know. Mark said he had helped Jenna with setting up accounts and that perhaps a bank employee had made an error. The mediator asked clarifying questions and each answer bent toward evasion. Then Mina spoke. She explained how transfers had been structured to obscure the origin and destination, and how signature analysis showed an anomaly in pressure points consistent with a traced signature, not a live one. She described in calm terms how forensic accounting maps movement across accounts, and how layering transfers through multiple accounts often indicates an attempt to camouflage the origin of funds. The words fraud and forger came into the room like cold wind. Jenna's hands began to tremble. A corner of Jenna's mouth twitched, and she said, "Fine, I did sign some things, but only because we were desperate." She explained a story that held elements of truth and of convenience. She told of debts she claimed she had and of a loan she had been promised by her mother which never arrived. Mark said he had thought it would be temporary and that he had planned to repay. He said the car was in part meant to help me get to appointments. He said they had never meant to hurt me. They said the words that people say when caught. They said, "I am sorry and we can fix this." The question was whether those words would translate into the return of $60,000 and into a crime being acknowledged. The mediator asked if financial restitution alone would resolve harm. I said of course it would not, but it would be necessary. I wanted an explanation that had accountability, not just apology. I wanted a plan for prevention. Attorney Coleman proposed a court-supervised restitution plan coupled with therapy for family members and financial education for Mark. Detective Alvarez suggested that the criminal investigation proceed and that restitution could be part of a plea if charges were made. Jenna requested time and said that she could put the BMW up for sale and return funds. Mark said he would sign an agreement to repay, but that he needed time. Mina suggested immediate freezes on certain accounts until a judge ordered otherwise. We agreed to ask the court for provisional measures. The conclusion was emotional and legal. The mediator drafted minutes and we recorded a tentative agreement. Jenna agreed to place the BMW in escrow and to begin a payment plan conditional on court approval. Mark signed a written admission that did not amount to a legal confession, but was a gesture with moral weight. They apologized, and the recording caught the rawness in their voices. It did not feel like vindication. It felt like a contract with stitches. We left the room with a plan to file and to bring the materials to the district attorney's office. The case moved slowly in the legal system. Attorney Coleman filed the motion for emergency relief and requested the forensic reports. The bank turned over additional metadata after a subpoena. The dealership responded with original paperwork and a manager's statement that included the email headers linking Jenna's account. Mina delivered a 23-page report with spreadsheets and annotated timelines. Forensic handwriting analysts submitted an assessment that described pressure discrepancies and stroke patterns that suggested tracing. That technical description is worth stating plainly. A forgery often shows uniform stroke pressure inconsistent with an individual's habitual variations. An expert compares the baseline oscillation of the real signature to the suspect sample. The comparison can reveal differences in letter formation, timing, and pressure distribution. These differences are recorded and displayed as part of an expert affidavit used in court. This is not sensational. It is a bit like matching the rhythm of a person's handwriting to a fingerprint. The district attorney opened a file, but cautioned that proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt takes time. They suggested that a civil restitution case might move faster and that simultaneous civil and criminal actions were possible. I felt both impatient and grateful for each small procedural step. I read legal motions, and the words restitution and conspiracy and elder fraud became familiar in my mouth like new vocabulary in a second language. I sat in waiting rooms and felt the carpet under my feet as hours passed. I watched the calendar and marked days with a colored pencil. I learned the slow arithmetic of legal time. There were several moments of intense tension that bore description because they were the fulcrums of the story. One was the day Jenna almost took the BMW out of the state. I received notice from Attorney Coleman that a transfer of title had been initiated. My stomach flipped and I could not stop the cold like water moving through my veins. I called the dealership and they confirmed the hold. Detective Alvarez intervened and had the registration blocked temporarily. The second moment was when Mark called late at night and sobbed and said he had made a terrible mistake. The sound of his voice made me remember his small hands and how he had once put a Band-Aid on my finger. The third was a day when Lily refused to come to visit for fear she would see me in court and told me she wanted family whole again. Those moments were about the human costs, beyond numbers. We finally reached a day in court when the judge looked at our pile of papers and asked questions about dozens of transfers. Jenna's eyes were red and she shifted in her chair. Mark wore a jacket that smelled faintly of motor oil and new fabric. The judge ordered an examination of the original power of attorney and asked that the dealership hold the vehicle pending the final determination. He set a schedule for a civil hearing and referred the criminal file to a prosecutor for review. It felt like a slow closure, but it was a closure. Tom, the reporter, wrote a careful piece that did not sensationalize the family name, but focused on elder fraud patterns. The article brought calls from strangers who said they had had similar experiences and who thanked me for being public. That communal response felt like a bandage. The epilogue comes in 3 parts, and I prefer to tell it plainly because endings are often where life returns to ordinary rhythms, and where consequences settle into shape. 1 month later, I had returned the lids to the jars and begun to sort mail with a new vigilance. The BMW sat in escrow at the dealership with a notice on its windshield. Jenna had signed paperwork agreeing to a preliminary restitution schedule, and a temporary restraining order protected any further transfers. I had met with a social worker from an elder advocacy group who helped me review my accounts and set up alerts for any movement. I felt edged in both relief and exhaustion. My hands had grown steadier because I had learned to ask for receipts and to demand paper trails. I took comfort in small rituals again, like sweeping the kitchen floor and folding towels. I slept better, though I still woke sometimes to the memory of the $3 clinking like a knell. The community response warmed me. Neighbors brought casseroles, and someone left a potted plant on the porch that smelt of rosemary. Paul stopped by and sat on the stoop and told me it had been hard to speak up. He said he was sorry he had not seen it sooner. Those moments stitched the small social network around me. 3 months later, the ledger had more lines in my favor. The civil hearing had ordered provisional restitution, and Jenna had sold the BMW. Money began to move back through accounts in tentative increments. The prosecutor had not yet filed criminal charges, but had opened further inquiries into the possibility of forgery. Mark began attending financial counseling sessions and therapy, and sometimes I met him in public to exchange documents. He was quieter now, and I saw in his face a new humility. Lily brought drawings when she visited and had begun to leave notes that said, "I love you, Mom," in a tidy, childish scrawl that made my eyes sting. Rosa organized a small workshop at the church on preventing elder fraud, and Attorney Coleman spoke about powers of attorney and the importance of oversight. The community seemed to have grown more alert and less indulgent of easy explanations that hide malfeasance. 6 months later, the dust settled into a new pattern. Jenna complied with the court-ordered restitution schedule, and the civil suit moved toward a settlement where a portion of funds would be returned, and a probationary agreement would limit her access to accounts. The district attorney filed a misdemeanor case related to unauthorized transfers, and the signatures were still under review by a handwriting expert. The lifestyle that had once been orchestrated around appearances had to recenter on responsibility. I had installed a second email for monitoring and had given power of attorney to a trusted attorney rather than a relative. It felt unsettling and necessary. My patrimony was not fully restored, and some relationships remained strained and maybe permanently altered, but there was also an unexpected gift. I felt the clarity of boundaries. I felt safety in the presence of professionals who had names and offices and processes. I felt like the piggy bank now was less a symbol of my naivety and more a talisman of survival. I had taken a fragile thing and turned it into a series of small defenses. If you watched this far, please subscribe and tell me in one sentence if you or someone you know has ever been surprised by a gift that had a hidden price. Your stories matter because they help others recognize patterns. Leave a comment that says, "I discovered blank," and if you want to share more, we will talk. This channel is about turning shock into steps and about learning when to ask for help. I am not telling this story to shame. I am telling it to illuminate how small gestures can be instruments of a con, and how paper and signatures and metadata can be the allies. As of truth, I do not think that all mistakes are crimes, nor that every family winter requires courtrooms. I do believe that trust is not a license and that love does not erase the need for documentation. I learned that asking for receipts is an act of stewardship and that a power of attorney is not a love token, but a legal instrument that needs scrutiny. I learned to get help and to set boundaries with kindness and firmness. In the end, I kept the house. Part of the patrimony stayed with me, and part of the restitution will be paid. Mark is working on rebuilding trust, and Jenna is under court oversight. The piggy bank sits on the shelf, filled now with small notes with dates and the names of people I trust with access. Lily comes over to help me make lemon pound cake, and she presses her small hands into the batter and laughs. That laugh is a sound I had forgotten I needed to hear. We are stitching. The work is messy and imperfect, but there is movement toward mending. If this story moved you, subscribe and share, and also check the description for links to resources about elder fraud and legal help in your area. There are organizations that can guide you through the paperwork and that can help you set up protections like restricted accounts and third-party monitoring. Trust your instincts and ask for paper.